Before I get too far, I need to point out one typo, and it sounded weird when I said it last Esquelita, and so my antenna went up and I verified this is a typo. The molecular weight of myoglobin is not 77 kilodaltons. That would make it larger than albumin, which it's not. It's 17. It should be 17. So correct your field guides, please, with that mistake. Okay, so we had gone over prescribing PERT, or prolonged intermittent renal replacement therapy, and I gave you just a hypothetical prescription, and I did challenge you to think about it in terms of standard weekly KT over V and try and devise your own prescription of prolonged intermittent renal replacement therapy. And, be prepared. Heaven forbid you're on service with me and we have the opportunity to do it. And I will say, remember, I told you to do this on your own, so I can trust that you know how to do this, right? So, all right. Now let's segue over to the various ways that we can describe CRRT dose. By far, the most conventional way to do that is not by calculating a formal urea clearance, though you do have the knowledge to do that and is not hard. Remember, it's just effluent urea nitrogen over blood urea nitrogen. Here's the formula, right? This has the similarity to the familiar creatinine clearance, where it's urine creatinine over plasma creatinine times my urine flow rate. So UV over P. So the analog of urine creatinine in this case is effluent urea nitrogen over blood urea nitrogen. The analog of the urine flow rate is simply how fast your dialysate and replacement fluid flows are flowing. And that's how you calculate a urea clearance, okay? Now, the most common way we do this is by effluent flow rates, okay? When we're describing CRRT, we often just say we're running a replacement fluid flow rate and dialysate flow rate of 1,000 milliliters per minute, for example. So you can express that as, because we're running dialysate and replacement, 2,000 milliliters per hour. Each one of those, there's 1,000 milliliters per hour. So you can say, I'm running 2 liters an hour of CRRT. That's how I do it. I do not make it weight-based. I don't take the trouble of dividing it because there is no clear threshold or benefit of prescribing 20 mils per kilogram per hour or 25 or 30. I don't go through the trouble of doing that extra math and then transmitting that information to other people I work with. I don't say, okay, let's increase the flow rate by 500 cc's per hour. Okay, well, let's recalculate that in terms of total effluent flow per milligram per milliliters per kilogram per hour. That's just too much math, especially if you're pulling this stuff into your notes. You have to recalculate the effluent flow rates. I just say you went from 2 liters an hour to 2.5 liters an hour, right? No math required, or simple math, just addition, okay? Now, the disadvantage of doing that is that you don't account for loss of efficiency. So it matters if you are running 2 liters an hour down the drain. If your blood flow rate is relatively slow, your total clearance may not be 2 liters an hour, but may actually be a fraction of that. So that is not captured by this simplified form of dosing summary or summarizing dosing. Okay, so that's why it's important to know how to calculate a urea clearance, even though in the real world, we don't do that typically. In the real world, we're just saying 2 liters an hour of CRRT, okay? We don't typically distill this down to a urea clearance. Again, this will all make sense within a month. You'll have the background knowledge to make all of this make sense if this is not sticking, okay? Now, Again, to compare what's happening with intermittent dialysis, I already made this point. In intermittent dialysis, you're running very high, relatively speaking, dialysate flow rates. You're running around 800 milliliters per minute of dialysate flow rate, and your blood flow rate is slower, 350 to 400, okay? In that scenario, blood flow rate is your primary determinant of urea clearance. In CRRT, remember, the blood flow rate is faster than the flow rate of replacement fluid and dialysate, and the main determinant of clearance is the replacement fluid and dialysate flow rates, okay? That is, it's effluent flow limited, blood flow limited for intermittent dialysis, okay? So if we looked at this graphically, and we calculated the urea clearance, okay? That's on the y-axis here, clearance of urea in mils per minute, okay? And on the x-axis, we express blood flow rate for a fixed dialysate flow rate of 33 mils per minute. You can see that as I crank up on my blood flow rate, I get progressive increase in urea clearance. But the point I want to make is that as you keep going beyond a blood flow rate, this is for hemodialysis, I should reinforce, this is just for hemodialysis. If I increase my blood flow rate beyond about 2 to 2.5 times my dialysate flow rate, right? In this case, my dialysate flow rate is 33 mils per minute. You can see my blood flow rate, if it's 2 times that, would be somewhere around here, 66 mils per minute. So at this threshold point of 2 to 2.5 times my dialysate flow rate, notice I don't get any more or very little bang for my buck with more urea clearance, okay? What does that mean in real life? It means that as you crank up on your blood flow rate beyond a mere 75 cc's per minute, if you go from 75 cc's per minute to 100 or 150 or 180, you're not getting any more urea clearance. Why? Because with CRT, my clearance is really limited by my total effluent flow rate. It really can never exceed 33 mils per minute. You can see that I'm plateauing out, okay? Now, when we look at hemofiltration, notice that when I'm in post-filter mode, which graphically looks like this, okay? When I'm in post-filter mode, always, we already went over this, effluent urea nitrogen is equal to blood urea nitrogen. That means my EUN to BUN ratio is always 1, right? In that urea clearance term. Here's my urea clearance formula, right? Urea clearance is simply EUN to BUN times my flow rates of dialysate or replacement fluid, or both, if I'm running both, okay? So in hemofiltration, I'm just running replacement fluid. So again, EUN to BUN ratio is always 1, no matter what my blood flow rate is. And you can see that my urea clearance is fixed at 33 mils per minute when I'm in post-filter mode. Okay? The problem with running lower blood flow rates when I'm in post-filter mode is when I run lower blood flow rates, I start getting hemoconcentration and I predispose to clotting. My filtration fraction goes higher as I run slower blood flow rates. Okay? Make sense? I'm really looking at second-year fellows right now because I'm assuming much of this is going over our first-year fellows' head. Or you might have, studied this a little bit for your problem set, and this might stick. Don't worry. I just made the point that these formal lectures are going to happen within a month, okay? So again, filtration fraction is the problem with lower flow rates when I'm in post-filter mode and clotting. but I don't have any drop in urea clearance. Urea clearance is always maximally efficient. EUN to BUN ratio is always 1. Okay? All right. Now, I do lose efficiency when I'm in pre-filter mode. Pre-filter CRT, if I run lower blood flow rates, I get more dilution of this urea before I hit the dialyzer or the hemofilter membrane. That dilution of urea reduces the effluent urea nitrogen. Okay. The slower the blood flow rate, the more the dilution. Okay. And that's evidenced by this drop of efficiency. So my blood flow rate is dropping as I go down this direction in this figure. So I'm losing urea clearance as my blood flow rate is dropping. I'm losing urea clearance. That is that loss of efficiency that arises from an EUN to BUN ratio that is dropping. Okay, and so my urea clearance becomes a smaller and smaller fraction of 33 mils per minute. If I was running infinite blood flow rate, this too will top out at 33 mils per minute. As I drop my blood flow rate, you can see that EUN to BUN ratio goes down and my urea clearance becomes a fraction of 33 mils per minute. Okay? That efficiency threshold, you can do this math, you can calculate this yourself. What is the actual EUN to BUN ratio? You can calculate this as a function of blood flow rate and replacement fluid flow rate. You can calculate the theoretical drop in concentration, right? If this is going 100 mils per minute and this is going 20 mils per minute, you're roughly going to get a 20% drop in my urea concentration. So my EUN to BUN ratio, you can actually calculate. So this drops to somewhere below 85%. That EUN to BUN ratio drops below 85% when my blood flow rate drops to 6 times my replacement fluid flow rate. That's why, okay, that's the emergence. That's where these rules of thumb of how much blood flow rate to prescribe come from. So again, when I'm on doing dialysis, I need a minimum blood flow rate of about 2.5 times my dialysate flow rate, right? That's when I get that drop of efficiency, that EUN to BUN ratio starts dropping below 0.85. Okay. When I'm running for pre-filter hemofiltration, I need my blood flow rate to be 6 times my replacement fluid flow rate. That's the point at which EUN to BUN drops below 0.85%. Everybody get that? Okay. All right. So here are some examples of, this is just a hypothetical 70-kilo person running a 1 liter per hour replacement and a 1 liter per hour dialysate flow rate. You would want that efficiency, you would achieve that efficiency easily with a blood flow rate of 150 mils per minute. Okay, this is going to easily achieve those, those thresholds. A quick and dirty verification of whether your blood flow rate is fast enough that I always use is, as long as your blood flow rate is 6 times my my replacement fluid flow rate, you can easily make that conclusion by dropping a 0. As long as blood flow rate, in this case, is over 100, you know that that's at least 6 times my replacement fluid flow rate, right? That's because that arises because of these changes in units. If I take 1,000, divide by 60 to get to mils per minute, multiply times 6, the net mathematical operation is divide by 10, right? Dividing by 60 to get it into mils per minute, multiplying times 6, the net mathematical operation is divide by 10. So that's a quick check, right? Divide by 10 is drop a zero. So for 1,000 mils per hour of replacement fluid flow rate, 100 would be enough blood flow rate to be 6 times my replacement fluid flow rate. Okay? So quick and dirty at the bedside. Filtration fraction, we already talked about. Filtration fraction can be a principle that describes glomerular filtration as well as CRRT, okay? Filtration fraction for a kidney refers to how much hemoconcentration is occurring as a function of renal plasma flow in the denominator. So that's how much plasma water is getting to the glomerulus, and then glomerular filtration rate in the numerator. Okay, that will tell you how much hemoconcentration you have in the post-glomerular capillaries, right? Because again, a proportion of, if I'm a glomerulus, right, and I have blood going to this glomerulus, okay, or plasma water, I'm going to say PW, plasma water, the plasma water that emerges from that glomerulus, I'll call this 1, plasma water 2, is going to be less because I have a proportion of that plasma water that is lost by glomerular filtration. Okay, so now I just replace the glomerulus with a hemofilter, right? And I can get the same net principle that's occurring. The degree of hemoconcentration that's happening in this plasma water 2 limb would be a function of how fast plasma water is flowing and how fast glomerular filtration is occurring, okay? So if I'm, the analog or the analogy is, if I'm pulling a lot of water across that hemofilter membrane because I'm prescribing lots of ultrafiltration or lots of replacement or effluent for replacement fluid or for convective clearance, then I'm getting more hemoconcentration. Okay, that hence the filtration fraction predicts how much clotting is occurring by predicting how much hemoconcentration is occurring. Okay, all right. So here we are. For CRRT, filtration fraction in principle, or as a rule of thumb, should be kept less than 20% in order to theoretically reduce clotting. It's not an end to pursue in and of itself. If I'm having no clotting, who cares if my filtration fraction is 30%? If I'm on heparin and I'm not clotting and my filtration fraction is 30%, leave it alone. There's no reason to pursue a lower filtration fraction as an end for itself. Okay. And I've summarized here that, well, I'll go through this because I think it's the most obvious. With hemodialysis, there's essentially no hemoconcentration that's occurring unless I'm adding some ultrafiltration. If I'm taking some fluid from the patient while they're on hemodialysis, that results in some hemoconcentration. But if I'm doing euvolemic dialysis, I'm taking no volume off, then as you flow down, okay, as I flow down the dialyzer, right, I have dialysate that's flowing in this direction. I have blood that's going in this direction. Solute is moving, right, by diffusion, but I'm not getting any hemoconcentration unless I'm simultaneously pulling some water out of the patient to shrink them. And so that is causing hemoconcentration. By the time I sample blood here, the hematocrit may be slightly elevated based on how much fluid I'm removing from the patient. And so for hemodialysis, filtration fraction is simply what is my ultrafiltration rate over blood flow rate. Now, if you're a purist, you would actually make the denominator plasma water. So you'd use the hematocrit to convert QB into plasma water flow. But again, filtration fraction is not an end to pursue in and of itself. It's just a predictor of clotting. And so you don't have to be precise about calculating a filtration fraction. Doesn't matter. If you're clotting, bad. If you're not clotting, good. Okay. Adjust your filtration fraction according to the need, not because the number is some precise number that you're trying to target. Okay. Notice that when I'm in pre-filter hemofiltration, I'm also arguing that the filtration fraction is merely UF over QB. Well, how does that make sense? Let's look at the figure. When I'm doing pre-filter hemofiltration, I'm putting in fluid at a rate of, let's say, 20 mils per minute. I'm pulling that same 20 mils per minute off, okay? That 20 mils per minute, let's do this, pencil. Okay, I'm pulling 20 mils per minute off. I'm putting in 20 mils per minute. All right, it is true that I become dilute here, okay? My hematocrit drops. I'm diluting. And then I'm concentrating here. That's true, okay? But I'm not having a net change in hemo concentration, right? Because if I sampled a hematocrit here, it might be 30%. It is true that I dropped to some arbitrary number. I'm just using numbers 25%. It's going to be some ratio of my blood flow to replacement fluid flow rate. And then I am concentrating back to 30% here. And so I do get hemoconcentration if I use this as a frame of reference. But using this as a frame of reference, I am not having a net hemoconcentration. So to me, it's irrelevant to include this as a filtration fraction parameter because you're looking for net hemoconcentration as a risk for clotting, okay? And so there is no net hemoconcentration that occurs with pre-filter hemofiltration as it does with post-filter hemofiltration. So filtration fraction can be distilled down to UF over QB. Okay, in post-filter hemofiltration, your filtration fraction is now a function of replacement fluid flow rate plus UF over QB. Looking at this figure, again, in post-filter hemofiltration, you do get net hemoconcentration, right? My hematocrit here is 30%. I'm pushing fluid across that membrane, maybe at 20 cc's an hour, okay, or minute, excuse me. My hematocrit here will indeed be increased to 35%. I am getting hemoconcentration and a predisposition to clotting. So it makes sense to include this term in the calculation of filtration fraction, okay? Plus any additional, if I want an additional 2 mils per minute of ultrafiltration, that is going to be 120 mils per hour of fluid removal from your patient in the ICU, that should be included as a filtration fraction term. Okay. All right. With these principles in mind, we can now kind of quickly, I'm going to go quickly so I can segue over to essential nephrology, review CRT prescriptions, because I know our second year fellows can do these in their sleep now. I don't have to make too many, tangents, except to say, since you are not commonly using heparin, remember you're trying to achieve essentially full dose anticoagulation. People are using heparin assays now. I guess I should change this. This is, old school. I didn't check heparin assays when I was a resident and fellow. We use PTTs, but we're working towards PTTs of around 60 seconds. You can go higher if you're clotting, but remember that is systemic anticoagulation. Even if you're infusing heparin in the CRT machine, that is going to your patient and they're getting systemically anticoagulated. Citrate anticoagulation is going to be prescribed as a percentage of blood flow rate. Why? Because as blood flow is faster, you need more citrate in order to create that low free calcium concentration to reduce the efficiency of coagulation. Remember, calcium is a cofactor for clotting. Okay, so if you're using, as a rule of thumb, QB of 100 mils per minute, if you do the math, 2.5% of 100 mils per minute expressed as mils per hour is a citrate infusion rate of 150. 3% of that is 180. So I typically knock down when I switch to CRT, I knock down my blood flow rate because we usually don't need much blood flow, right? Blood flow rate that is unnecessarily fast just makes you have to give unnecessarily fast citrate, and then you'll get more citrate toxicity. So anytime you're switching to citrate anticoagulation, knock down that blood flow rate to the minimum flow that you can. Doesn't have to, not minimum. If you go minimum, it can be as low as 70, and then your nurse is going to keep getting these low flow alarms. So go down to about 100 mils per minute, and that usually is a sweet spot. You'll still get some low flow alarms for a well-functioning catheter, okay? But you want to knock down your blood flow rate, or you're going to have to get higher citrate infusion rates and more citrate toxicity. You're trying to reduce that ionized calcium concentration in the circuit, normal being around 5. You're trying to get it down to like 1.3. That would be, so if somebody's clotting while on citrate, before you make adjustments, you can certainly check a post-filter ionized calcium, make sure it's adequately low before you make your next maneuver to reduce clotting. Okay. The disadvantages of citrate is it's a bit more expensive when you factor in the ionized calcium checks as well as the actual citrate you're administering and the calcium drip. This is a trisodium citrate solution. So it is hypertonic. So theoretically, you can get hypernatremic. You don't typically get it hypernatremic, but it is a risk when you're giving higher flows. The citrate is metabolized and generates bicarbonate. It's not directly metabolized to bicarbonate, but the metabolism of citrate generates bicarbonate, and so metabolic alkalosis can occur. And predisposing factors for citrate toxicity include liver disease, where citrate metabolism is impaired. Higher citrate infusion rates should be self-evident, why that is correlated with citrate toxicity. But what may not be so obvious is lower CRT doses are associated with higher risk of citrate toxicity. Why is that? Well, CRT actually clears citrate. And so if you lower CRT doses, you're giving more citrate to your patient. Okay, the CRT is actually clearing some of the citrate. So I don't typically go less than about 2 liters an hour for most patients on citrate, because otherwise you tend to get more alkalosis and citrate toxicity, especially in the context of liver disease. Okay. The manifestation that you should look for citrate toxicity is a total calcium, which is high, but an ionized calcium that is low or normal. Okay. Remember, total calcium is going to be your free calcium, that is your ionized calcium, your calcium that is bound to phosphorus, your calcium that is bound to albumin. And if you happen to have calcium complexed with citrate, that too is going to be contributing to your total calcium, okay, TCal, right? So if my TCal is normal, because some proportion of total calcium is calcium citrate, but my ionized calcium is low, that is a giveaway for citrate toxicity, okay? So look for that as one sign of citrate toxicity. In more profound states of citrate toxicity, your anion gap can actually go up. Why is that? Well, the net charge of calcium 2 plus and citrate 3 minus is 1 minus. And so you can start elevating your anion gap as well with calcium citrate accumulation. Okay. Still moving slow. All right. So the fluids that you can choose, I guess, know your fluids. Prismasol has bicarbonate in it. It also has lactate in it, and it does have glucose in it. So it actually defends against the hypoglycemia of sepsis that patients may manifest. You can vary the potassium content. You can vary the calcium content. Certainly, let me compare this for people who are not used to, or maybe first new fellows who are not used to looking at our converting units between milliequivalents, millimoles, and milligrams per deciliter. A calcium of 2.5 milliequivalents per liter is equal to 1.25 millimoles per liter for a divalent ion. You multiply times 2 to get to milliequivalents. For sodium, they're identical. Milliequivalents and millimoles are identical because it's monovalent. So 2.5 milliequivalents is 1.25 millimoles. If you need to know the molecular weight of calcium, which is 40, to convert that to milligrams per deciliter, and that would be a free calcium, ionized calcium of 5. Okay, so 2.5 milliequivalents is equal to an ionized calcium of 5. That is normal. 3.5 milliequivalents is a high calcium dialysate. Okay, obviously 0 is low. Okay, so when I'm using citrate anticoagulation, you must make sure your dialysate is free of calcium because you're trying to lower the calcium concentration in the circuit. You don't want to be giving calcium in the dialysate. Okay, so we use a 0 calcium dialysate. You also want a 0 calcium fluid in your pre-filter fluids, right? Again, on your post-filter side, you can put calcium back. Okay, Foxilum is a phosphorus-containing replacement fluid with 3.1 milligrams per deciliter of phosphate in it. Notice that the bicarbonate content of Foxilum is actually lower than Prismasol. The presumption is when you're running 0 calcium Foxilum, you're also giving citrate. Okay, and so they intentionally lower the bicarbonate of Foxilum so that it can ameliorate some of the metabolic alkalosis that may occur with citrate. So to combat the citrate toxicity, they make Foxilum 0 with a bicarbonate concentration that's at 22 millimoles per liter. Okay, but with normal calcium or normal calcemic Foxilum, your bicarb is the typical 30-ish. Okay. All right. I won't belabor this because I think we've talked about all of this in all of the previously stated principles, making sure your blood flow rate is fast enough, 6 times your replacement fluid flow rate when you're in hemofiltration mode, 5 times if you're specifically doing post-filter. I simplify it because it's easy math. I just do, whether it's pre-filter or post-filter, 6 times my blood flow, my replacement fluid flow rates is my minimum blood flow rate. Instead of using 6 and 5, I just simplify. Close enough. 6 times my replacement fluid flow rate is sufficient blood flow rate. For hemodialysis, 2.5 times my dialysate flow rate is the minimum blood flow rate. Even though you don't demand this, just know your machine. PrismaFlex can go all the way to 450 blood flow rate. You guys are running 150 and 180. If you have a super sick patient, you can start cranking that up. Okay, so if you need a lot of clearance in someone with an ammonia level of 1,000, we sometimes get urea cycle defects that we're managing, toxic alcohol poisoning with a very high osmolar gap. You may also want to go really high with your CRRT flow rates. You may need to go to blood flow rates of 200 plus, and you should be able to do that. And also know that even though you're typically going 2 liters an hour, these Prismaflex pumps can go to 8 liters an hour. So you can really get up to 133 mils per minute of urea clearance, okay, which is super physiologic, okay, meaning your urea clearance is less than GFR because you reabsorb urea. So GFR is around 133, but urea clearance is roughly half of that or 2/3 of that. Okay, so you're getting urea clearances that are more than a kidney is getting. Mm-hmm.
But we could last such high blood flow rates that be equivalent, or we still do H?
Well, it's not quite equivalent, right? Because we walked through what is your urea clearances with HD. You're getting close to 300. So you're still getting more clearance. And I'll just, refer you back to some of these figures that we looked at for urea clearance for hemodialysis. You can see clearance on the y-axis, dialysate flow rate. So when you're running 400, these dotted lines the solid lines are in vivo. So when I'm running 300, I guess my biggest solid line here is the orange, 450 blood flow rate with a dialysate flow rate of 800. My in vivo clearances are close to 300 mils per minute. So it makes sense if you have a really, really sick patient to, even given the capacity of Prismaflex, put them on intermittent dialysis for more clearance, small molecule clearance. Okay, know your circuit and where these transducers are measuring flow pressures. Sophie and I went through this in recent discussions. So here's my blood pump, right? My access pressure is typically a negative pressure because it's upstream of my blood pump, okay? So a dysfunctional catheter will make a very negative access pressure alarm. My return line, okay, is downstream of my blood pump. So a dysfunctional catheter can make a highly positive return pressure alarm. Okay, so if I have a very negative access pressure, or a highly positive return pressure, I should be thinking about like a kinked catheter or a catheter that's clotting. Okay. Now my filter pressure is downstream of my blood pump. It's also a positive number. Okay. Just like my return pressure. And if I start getting gunk clotting my filter pressure goes up. Okay. But guess what? If my return line is also clotted, that clotting that's happening on the return is also going to be reflected as a high filter pressure. So when I hear a problem with CRRT and a question of clotting, I'm interested really in two numbers. What is my return pressure and what is my filter pressure? If both my return pressure and my filter pressure are high, I am thinking that this is not clotting filter, this is a dysfunctional catheter, okay? And so I need to get the catheter alteplaced or replaced, okay? If, on the other hand, I have high filter pressures, but my return pressure is normal, then that's clotting within the filter. I'm thinking about heparin and citrate, okay? In reality, nursing focuses too much on TMP, a calculated value. The problem with TMP is it's really not directly or solely influenced, I'll say, by my filter pressure. You can see that my filter pressure does inform my TMP. But what else informs my TMP is my is my replacement fluid flow rates, okay? My pressure on my effluent side, okay? If you pull more fluid from your patient or you prescribe more replacement fluid flow rates, that means you've got to pull that fluid across that membrane. You increase the transmembrane pressure. Okay, and so that is not a surrogate of clotting. If I'm just pulling more fluid from my patient or I'm applying more convective clearance, but unfortunately your nurses are tuned, they're taught TMPs, but high TMPs are bad, your filter may be clotting, call your provider, stop therapy. Really, filter pressure should be the action item that is prompting a change or a consideration of change, right? Either address the access or address the clotting with citrate and heparin. Okay. So I usually try and say, okay, I hear you, but what is the filter pressure? Or I look at it on the flow sheets. Okay. All right. So I've gone over some of these principles in the troubleshooting. I think we can go through these reasonably quickly. Cannot detect access means the patient is actually disconnected and the blood is flowing on the ground or air is getting sucked in the line, heaven forbid. Okay, but usually it's just my blood flow is too low. All right, so nursing frequently calls you, blood flow is, I cannot detect access, alarm keeps happening. And your solution is, if you're not disconnected, just increase the blood flow rate. Okay, now if they're on citrate, that's then gets you into this circle of complications. Okay, I increase my blood flow rate, I have to increase my citrate then, and I get citrate toxicity, okay, particularly in a liver patient. So sometimes you tell the nurse, don't increase the blood flow rate, just keep clearing the alarm. I hear you, it's tedious, you're 1-to-1, shouldn't be that bad, just clear the alarm every time you see it. Or in some cases, I even, kind of get my MacGyver tool out and I clamp the line a little bit to create some resistance so that their cannot detect access is ameliorated. Okay, that's off protocol. Okay, not every nurse will allow you to do that. Okay, you get one of those blue scissor clamps and you kind of partially clamp the line. You can do it, anywhere on the circuit that's, downstream of these transducers, right? So generally, this is going to be a problem with the return pressure being, too low. In that scenario, I'm clamping it basically, the transducer is, you got to know your transducers, I guess. I don't have a picture of them. The transducer is, the return transducer is next to your air trap. So as long as you're clamping the line before it's going to the patient, it's post return transducer. Okay. All right. So the access being too negative or the return is extremely positive, you have an access problem. Clotting access, kinked access. Sometimes you're sucking against a vessel wall because you've just dried the heck out of them and they're hypovolemic and their SVC is actually collapsing around that catheter. So those are the options to consider, or the problems to consider as you address those problems. Okay. The alarming TMP is too high. It's a filter clotting, or remember, I'm just pulling too much fluid across that membrane from ultrafiltration rates that are excessive, replacement fluid flow rates that are excessive. Either replace the filter, anticoagulate the patient, or if it's appropriate, shift some of that replacement fluid flow rate clearance, convective clearance, over to dialysate. Right? So if I want a net clearance of 3 liters, and I have 1.5 liters of dialysate flow rate, 1.5 liters of replacement fluid flow rate, and I still want 3 liters of total clearance, crank your dialysate up to 2 liters, put your replacement fluid down to 1 liter, or 2.5 liters and 500. Your blood flow rates are going to be more than enough generally. Remember, because your blood flow rate need only be 2.5 times my dialysate flow rates. Okay? Make sense? Thinking about this or some other? Okay, good. Any questions about this? Make sense? Okay, good. All right. So filter clotting, frequent clotting, there's a number of causal factors. It's not always just they need citrate. You know, if it's clotting, um, or these can also be an access pressure that's a problem with frequent therapy downtime. So there's a lot of net of problems that can result in a net experience of frequent filter clotting. And I've said the point of, look at your filter pressure and return lines individually to determine whether this is an access problem, really at root cause, or it frankly is a clotting problem in the catheter. I'm sorry, in the filter. Okay. It's not always just add heparin or citrate.